This time it's 5 things that killed the British bike industry. The sad demise of the British bike industry was caused by a number of factors. There will be those that tell you that it was just this cause or that cause and just say it was one particular cause. Of course, as with most things in history, it's far more complicated than that. And ultimately a number of factors were at play, some more important than others. Today, however, we're just going to talk about 5 of them. The Japanese. The Japanese industry, if you like, is almost the pantomime bad guy when it comes to the fall of the British industry. And to use modern parlance, it's the soundbite version of the demise that you'll often get in pub talk. But this does ignore the notion that many British companies had already gone bust or were on the brink of going bust even before the Japanese arrived. And let's face it, British companies in the late 50s weren't going bust because they feared the Japanese might be coming along at some point. And certainly the Japanese did adversely affect the industry, but they also adversely affected the industries in other countries across Europe. And industrial collapse was not an only British thing. The motorcycle industry across Europe, including Germany, was actually in major trouble before the Japanese arrived. And in Britain as in Europe, by the time the Japanese arrived, the motorcycle industry in general had collapsed. And this is something that's continued to this day, with motorcycles in the UK making up less than 1% of all road users. And the sales figures of Japanese motorcycles in the British market today are tiny by the standards of the 1950s. The management. This is another great British trope, the fat cat businessman mismanaging the company and spending all the profits, whilst using old-fashioned manufacturing techniques when they could have invested money to modernise the factories, and so on and so forth. Now this is a description which to some extent does fit the BSA group. Certainly the management diversified in too many areas and didn't concentrate on their core businesses, and frankly they lost interest in motorcycles. But this simply cannot be applied across the whole industry. Many companies were small and run by enthusiastic management. There were no Elon Musk type billionaires here, and even the bulk of BSA's profits came from other industries such as munitions. They didn't make a huge amount of money from the motorcycle side of the business. And whilst in the case of AMC and BSA Group, you certainly could blame the management to some extent, this cannot be applied across the whole industry. BSA and AMC were not the motorcycle industry in Great Britain. There were many other companies besides. Rockers and cafe racers. In 1950s England, the motorcycle was just a cheap means of transport. In that sense, there was no real subculture attached to the motorcycle. The early 60s was a time of full employment in the UK, and with money in their pocket, many young men purchased motorcycles. They didn't quite have the money to purchase their first cars at this time, and it was around these young men that the subcultures of cafe racers and rockers grew. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before the popular media was filled with stories of motorcyclists being killed while racing, or of fights and brawls with mods on the seafronts at many British coastal resorts. While there's no doubt that many of these stories are grossly exaggerated, or at times simply fabricated, the fact is nothing sells copy like bad news. And this resulted in a damaging of the reputation of motorcycles and motorcyclists in the eyes of the great British public for the next few decades, with bikers banned from many venues, and perhaps even more damagingly, many parents simply banning their kids from buying one. The motor car. Now it could be argued that the British and indeed the European motorcycle industry simply went the way the US motorcycle industry had done many decades before, where the advent of the Ford Model T had swept away most of the motorcycle manufacturers. This did not happen in quite the same way in Europe, however. European motorcycles were generally smaller and much less expensive than those massive V-twins and 4-cylinder bikes that had been produced by the American industry. And this, coupled with generally lower wages, meant that the Ford Model T didn't have quite the same impact, although it did inspire a number of British motorcycle manufacturers to venture into car manufacturing, Triumph and Rover being particularly notable. And even companies such as BSA and AJS were involving themselves in car manufacture during the 1930s. Although the Great Depression would adversely affect the car industry, and in some ways this did help the motorcycle industry, who began to concentrate on the production of small commuter motorcycles. After the Second World War, the car industry began to scale up production and was producing around 800,000 vehicles a year by the early 50s, although in truth most of these machines were sold abroad, with the British economy desperate for exports. Consequently, very few British-made cars were actually sold into the home market. As a result, the British motorcycle industry boomed during this period, with bikes outnumbering cars on British roads. If you owned a car, you were likely a GP or a vicar. However, in the last part of the 50s, the industry began to change, with the numbers of British cars being produced up to over 2 million units per year, with the industry increasingly focusing its attention on the home market. And then in 1959 came the Mini. The Mini was a tremendous sales success, so much so that the rest of the industry quickly followed suit, with a number of cars targeted at working class families, such as the Vauxhall Victor and of course the Ford Cortina. And it's no doubt that these cars are the single greatest factor in the demise of the British and indeed the European motorcycle industry. By way of an example, AMC Associated Motorcycles in 1959, the year in which the Mini was first announced, posted a fairly healthy profit. In 1960, they posted a dramatic loss and would continue to lose money until their final demise in 1966. A story which is pretty much repeated across the entire British motorcycle industry, with the exception of Triumph BSA Group, who continue to remain profitable by virtue of their American sales. A Cinderella industry. Now, when we talk about an industry being a Cinderella industry, this has nothing whatsoever to do with Disney princesses. Now, this phrase in fact refers to industries which are seen as intrinsically less important than others. The motorcycle industry is in the shadow of the car industry, for example, and this is very much the case in the United Kingdom. In some ways this is to do with the class system, because by the 1940s the motorcycle had gone from, well, a rich boy's plaything to cheap, economical transport, while the car was something very much for the middle classes, and was therefore much more desirable. A car was aspirational. A motorcycle may have been a symbol of freedom, but it was also rather a symbol of poverty too. And in Britain such things are important. Just look at attitudes towards companies such as Skoda before they were bought out by Volkswagen. Being German owned makes them so much more desirable. Early Skodas with their rear engines were very much solid bits of kit, but they were also symbols of poverty, and so were often ridiculed. Such is the way with British society. This becomes a problem for the bike industry when they're in dire need of investment. In short, it's much easier to get money from the bank if you want to modernise your car factory than if you want to modernise your motorcycle factory in the 1960s. And while Triumph is given some financial help by the government, the car industry is nationalised to save it from oblivion. Incidentally, both Moto Guzzi and Ducati were nationalised in Italy to keep them alive. In Britain, however, there was simply not the financial or indeed the political will to keep the companies alive, with inevitable results. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. It is a subject we will come back to at a later date, of course. If there is a subject or a machine you'd like to see us cover in the future, please get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thanks for watching.